She hasn't worked a real job in years. My sister said it clearly, like she was giving directions to the grocery store. Calm, certain, helpful. The jury watched her, not me. She's been collecting money from our mother's trust without proving she's employed. There it was, laid out neat and clean. Fraud, but dressed up as concern. I sat at the defense table in Sullivan County Court, hands folded back, straight dress uniform, replaced with a dark civilian suit. No insignia. No hint of rank. Just Meredith Calloway, eldest daughter, apparently unemployed. Allison didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was quiet enough to hear the ceiling fan turning. Our father sat behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight. He nodded once as if to confirm her version of events. She left town at 18, Allison continued. And since then, no one has ever seen proof that she works anywhere. That part was technically true. No one back home had. The jurors wrote things down. A man in the front row leaned forward like he was trying to catch me in a lie before I opened my mouth. Allison explained the trust. Our mother had set it up before she died 3 years ago. The condition was simple: any beneficiary had to demonstrate ongoing lawful employment or active service to receive annual disbursements. I had received $82,000 over 3 years. She told us she works in D.C., Allison said, but there's no company, no office, no website, no public records, nothing. Her attorney held up a folder. Private investigator report. Screenshots. Database searches. Clean. Empty. No LinkedIn profile. No corporate registration. No business address tied to my name. From a civilian perspective, it looked like I didn't exist. She hasn't shown this family a single pay stub. Allison turned toward the jury. Our mom worked her whole life. That trust was supposed to protect us, not fund a lie. There it was again. Lie. The word settled in the room. My attorney, Thomas Hale, didn't interrupt. He'd objected earlier when phrasing crossed into accusation, but the judge allowed most of it. This was a civil fraud claim. The jury was entitled to hear the basis. Fraud. Intentional misrepresentation. That was what they were calling it. Allison didn't look angry. That would have been easier to handle. She looked convinced. She wasn't there when Mom needed her most, she added. But she was there to collect the money. That line landed harder than the employment claim. Our mother's last year had been slow and ugly. Chemotherapy, hospital visits. Allison managed most of it. She lived 15 minutes away. I flew in twice between assignments. Short visits. No explanations. I couldn't explain. Allison described the investigator she hired. Local guy. $45 an hour. He ran employment databases, tax record searches, corporate filings. He couldn't find anything, she said. Because there's nothing to find. Her attorney walked the jury through the timeline. 3 annual distributions from the trust. Direct deposit. No supporting documentation provided to the trustee beyond a brief statement of employment in Washington. Is there any public record, he asked her, that your sister works for the organization she claims? No. Any payroll record? No. Any evidence at all that she's actively employed? No. Each answer was simple. Controlled. I kept my face neutral. Years of briefings under fluorescent lights train you to manage that. The attorney turned toward me. Colonel Calloway. He paused slightly before the rank. Can you provide this court with any publicly verifiable proof that you have been employed over the last 15 years? Publicly verifiable. That qualifier mattered. The records of my service exist, I said evenly. Publicly, no. He let that hang. So the jury is being asked to accept that you have a job they cannot see, verify, or confirm. I'm asking the jury to accept that my service is documented through the proper channels. He smiled faintly. Channels that are invisible to this court. My attorney objected to the characterization. The judge overruled, reminding the jury they would determine credibility. From the gallery, my father shifted in his seat. He didn't look at me. He watched Allison like she was the only person in the room making sense. The attorney approached the exhibit table and lifted a printed report. This is the comprehensive background investigation conducted into the defendant's claimed employment, he said. It shows no employer of record matching her statements. The pages were passed to the jury. One of the jurors frowned at a screenshot of a blank search result page. Another nodded slowly. She told our mother she worked in analysis, Allison continued. But when Mom asked where she would just say federal contracts, that's not an answer. I remembered that conversation. It was in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and coffee. My mother had asked where I was assigned. I told her I worked in analysis. That was the safest word available. Allison faced the jury again. My sister wants you to believe she has some kind of mysterious career. But the truth is simple. There's no proof. And the trust required proof. Her attorney stepped forward. The plaintiff contends that the defendant intentionally misrepresented her employment status to gain access to trust funds. Funds that rightfully belonged to both daughters under the conditions set by their late mother. Late mother, dead mother, stealing from our dead mother. The phrase had been repeated enough that it started to feel like a headline. The judge adjusted a stack of papers on the bench. He hadn't spoken much. He listened, occasionally wrote something down. His nameplate read, Daniel Whitaker. Allison's attorney looked at me again. Isn't it true, he asked, that you cannot provide this jury with a single civilian document proving you have been employed continuously since leaving college? I cannot provide a civilian document, I answered. He nodded as if that settled everything. Nothing further. Allison returned to her seat. Our father leaned toward her and whispered something. She gave a small nod, eyes still fixed ahead. Across the aisle, Thomas Hale remained calm. He had a legal pad, open pen resting flat across the page. No frantic notes, no panic. Outside the courtroom doors, footsteps moved down the hallway. The sound echoed briefly against tile before fading. Inside, the air felt heavier. The judge glanced toward the defense table. Counsel, he said evenly, you may proceed when ready. Thomas closed his folder without rushing. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and looked toward the bench. We would like to address the matter of employment verification. Allison shifted in her seat. The jurors leaned back, waiting. Thomas didn't raise his voice when he stepped forward, and neither did the room. He stood still for a moment, as if measuring how much of this needed to be said in public. Then he turned slightly toward the jury. Before we address verification, he said it's important to understand context. Context. That word felt heavier than fraud. Allison shifted in her chair. Our father straightened. Thomas didn't argue about search results or databases yet. He started somewhere else. Colonel Calloway left home at 18 on an ROTC scholarship, he said. She was commissioned into the United States Army at 22. A few jurors glanced at me differently, but not dramatically. Military service isn't exotic in Pennsylvania. It's common. Predictable. She has been on active duty since. Allison's attorney stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Sustained Judge Whitaker said calmly. Lay foundation. Thomas nodded once. He approached the witness stand. I walked up without hesitation. The wood felt the same under my hand as before. Solid, worn, civilian. State your name for the record. Meredith Calloway. You were commissioned into the United States Army in 2002. Yes. Have you been on active duty continuously since that date? Yes. He let that sit without embellishment. Allison's attorney crossed his arms. Where have you been stationed over the last 22 years? Various locations, I answered, including overseas deployments and domestic assignments. Can you name those assignments? Not in full detail. Why not? Because some of them are classified. There it was. Not dramatic, just factual. The attorney stepped closer. So the jury is once again asked to accept something they cannot verify. I'm stating a fact. He gave a small shrug. A fact that leaves no trail. He wasn't wrong about the trail. There wasn't one a civilian could follow. Thomas resumed. Did your mother know you were serving in the Army? Yes. Did she know you deployed? Yes. Did she ever express concern that you were unemployed? No. That answer shifted something subtle in the room. Allison leaned forward. Mom asked where you worked, she said from her seat before her attorney could stop her. The judge looked up. Ms. Calloway, you'll address the court through counsel. Allison sat back but didn't look satisfied. Thomas kept his questions precise. Colonel, during your mother's final year, were you assigned full-time duties? Yes. Were you authorized to disclose the nature of those duties? No. He stopped there. No long explanation about operational security. No patriotic speech. Just structure. The attorney for Allison rose for cross-examination again. You said you were deployed, yet you were only physically present with your mother twice in her final year. Yes. Because of work. Yes. And you cannot explain that work. I cannot explain details. He paced once in front of the jury. From the outside, he said, "This looks like someone who left town and never looked back." I met his eyes. From the outside, I replied, "Most things look simpler than they are." A juror in the back wrote that down. He shifted tactics. "Isn't it true that you rarely called home?" I called when I could. How often? It varied. Weekly, monthly. It depended on where I was assigned. The implication was clear. Distance equals neglect. Allison's attorney turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard that the defendant cannot produce public proof of employment. You've heard she cannot explain her assignments. And you've heard she was absent during the most difficult period of her mother's life." He let that hang. "Our client stayed. She handled the hospital visits, the insurance paperwork, the mortgage, the estate planning. That part was accurate. Allison did handle most of it. Being in the Army," he continued, "does not exempt someone from the conditions of a private trust." That was the pivot. Military service wasn't being attacked directly. It was being reframed as irrelevant. The judge made a note. Thomas didn't object. He didn't need to. The legal argument would come later. The jury's focus moved back to me. The attorney leaned on the rail slightly. "Did you provide your sister or the trustee with any documentation showing your employment status?" "I provided a statement of active service." "Signed by whom?" "By me. So no third-party verification." "Not at that time." He nodded slowly, satisfied. From the gallery, my father finally looked at me. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The kind that assumes guilt before proof. I remembered the morning I left home. One duffel bag. A bus ticket. Frost on the ground. My father standing in the driveway telling me not to come back broke. I hadn't come back broke. I just hadn't come back much at all. Allison's attorney stepped aside. No further questions. Thomas returned to the podium. "Colonel, why didn't you provide civilian documentation of employment to your family?" "Because my assignments don't generate civilian documentation." "Are you currently under orders?" "Yes." "Are you subject to military law?" "Yes." "Are false statements under oath punishable under military law?" "Yes." "Would risking a fraud conviction in civilian court jeopardize your military career?" "Yes." The jury absorbed that quietly. Thomas didn't argue the point. He didn't need to. He walked back to his table and opened a slim folder. Not the thick one with motions. A smaller one. Allison watched closely now. The judge looked up from his notes. "Counsel," he said, "are we moving toward verification?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied evenly. Across the room, Allison's attorney stiffened slightly. Thomas placed a single envelope on the table in front of him. It wasn't large. Plain white. Official. He rested his hand on it without opening it. The air in the courtroom shifted in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with anticipation. Allison glanced at the envelope, then at me as if expecting me to look nervous. I didn't. Thomas lifted the envelope. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense requests permission to submit a limited federal verification of active duty service under Title 10 for in-camera review." The words were procedural. Boring, even. But Allison's attorney rose immediately. "Objection." Judge Whitaker didn't respond right away. He looked at the envelope instead. The objection hung in the air for a second before Judge Whitaker lifted his eyes from the envelope. "On what grounds?" he asked. "All discovery deadlines have passed." Allison's attorney replied, "If the defense intends to introduce new evidence, it should have been disclosed during pretrial." Thomas didn't move from where he stood. "This document was not available during pretrial," he said. "It required federal authorization." Authorization from whom? The attorney pressed. "From the Office of the General Counsel, Department of Defense." That shifted the temperature in the room just enough for people to notice. Judge Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. "Counsel approach." Both attorneys stepped up to the bench. The white envelope went with them. The jury couldn't hear what was being said, but they could see body language. Allison folded her arms tightly. Our father leaned forward, trying to read lips from 15 feet away. After a short exchange, the judge nodded once. "Very well," he said aloud. "The court will review the document in camera. The jury will disregard any speculation about its contents." He stood. The bailiff escorted him toward the side chamber. The courtroom doors closed softly behind him. Allison exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, not quite under her breath. Her attorney leaned down and spoke quietly to her. She shook her head, still watching the closed door. I remained seated beside Thomas. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Everything that could be said had already been said. The trust dispute had started as paperwork. 3 years earlier, after our mother's funeral, we met with the trustee in a small office above a bank downtown. The trust was straightforward. Margaret Calloway Family Trust. Equal distribution to both daughters subject to annual proof of lawful employment or active service. My mother had added that clause herself. She knew our father. She knew the way he equated worth with visible labor. She knew the way he would measure my life from a distance. At the time, Allison hadn't questioned my eligibility. The first year's distribution passed without issue. The second as well. The third year changed everything. Real estate slowed. Interest rates climbed. Allison's commission checks shrank. Her adjustable rate mortgage reset that spring. Payments jumped nearly $900 a month. She never told me that directly. I learned it through financial disclosures attached to her complaint. Her lawsuit didn't just challenge my eligibility. It accused me of intentionally misrepresenting my employment status to gain access to funds. That's what elevated it from a trust dispute to civil fraud. Fraud required intent. Fraud required deception. Fraud required a story. The private investigator's report became the spine of that story. The report was methodical. Searches through state business registries, federal contractor databases, employment verification services, tax ID cross-references. Nothing tied my name to a civilian employer. From a civilian standpoint, the absence looked deliberate. Allison's attorney had built his argument around that absence. If she works, he told the jury earlier, there would be evidence. There is none. He wasn't wrong about what the report showed. He just didn't understand what it couldn't show. The side chamber door remained closed. A juror shifted in his seat. Another glanced at the clock on the wall. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation. Allison leaned toward her attorney again. This time her voice carried. "What could possibly be in there?" she asked. He kept his tone measured. "Verification, if it's legitimate, will confirm active duty status. It won't reveal details. And if it's not legitimate, then we proceed." Proceed. That word carried weight. If the document failed to satisfy the judge, the case would continue. The jury would deliberate on whether I intentionally misrepresented my employment to access trust funds. A fraud finding wouldn't just mean repayment. It would trigger mandatory reporting to my chain of command. It would prompt a formal financial review under clearance protocols. It would become part of my permanent record. Promotion boards don't like unresolved fraud allegations. Thomas remained composed beside me. "You're steady," he said quietly. "I am." He nodded once. Good. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't need to. The document either met the legal threshold or it didn't. Across the aisle, our father finally spoke. "Allison," he said softly, "you did the right thing." She didn't answer. She was staring at the door. The trust had been my mother's final attempt at balance. She knew we were different. She knew our lives had taken separate paths. Allison built hers in the same county where we were born, married a contractor, joined the school board, hosted Thanksgiving every year. I built mine elsewhere, not because I wanted distance, because the Army assigned distance. I thought that would be enough. The door to the side chamber opened. Judge Whitaker stepped back into the courtroom holding the envelope. It was no longer sealed. He returned to the bench without expression and sat down. The room quieted automatically. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document in front of him. "All parties remain seated," he said calmly. Allison's attorney straightened in his chair. Judge Whitaker flipped a single page, then another. He didn't rush. He read carefully, line by line. His face gave nothing away. After a long moment, he removed his glasses and set them on the bench. That small movement drew every eye in the room. He looked first at Thomas, then at me, then at Allison. "This court," he said evenly, "has reviewed the submitted verification." He paused, not for effect, but to choose his words. The jurors leaned forward in unison. Allison's hands tightened around the edge of her chair. The judge continued, his tone measured and precise. "The document confirms continuous active duty service." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Allison blinked once. Her attorney shifted his posture. Judge Whitaker kept his gaze steady. Counsel, he said, looking at Allison's attorney, do you intend to proceed with an allegation of intentional fraud in light of this verification? Allison's attorney didn't answer immediately. He cleared his throat and glanced down at the document in front of the judge, even though he couldn't read it from where he stood. Your Honor. He began carefully, the plaintiff does not dispute that the defendant has served in the military. The issue is whether she satisfied the trust's employment verification requirement in a timely and transparent manner. He pivoted fast. That was his job. Judge Whitaker put his glasses back on. The document before the court verifies continuous active duty status under Title 10, he said evenly. That satisfies the employment clause as written. Allison shifted in her seat. That's not what this is about, she said under her breath. Her attorney touched her arm lightly. The judge continued, voice steady and procedural. The question now is whether the plaintiff wishes to continue pursuing a fraud claim, given that the foundational allegation that the defendant was not employed has been addressed. Fraud requires intent. Intent requires a lie. The document had just removed the lie. Allison's attorney stood straighter. We maintain, he said, that the defendant failed to provide adequate verification when requested by the trustee. That omission created reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion. That sounded better than accusation. Thomas remained calm beside me. The trustee received a signed statement of active service, he said, which at the time was sufficient under the trust's administrative guidelines. That statement was self-issued, Allison's attorney replied, without independent confirmation. Because independent confirmation requires federal authorization, Thomas answered. The judge held up a hand. I am not interested in relitigating administrative preference, he said. The clause requires active employment or service. It does not require public documentation. That narrowed the field. Allison stared at me now, not with anger but confusion. This isn't fair, she said quietly. It wasn't loud enough to be a disruption. Just loud enough to be heard. For her, this had never been about Title 10 or federal authorization. It was about absence. It was about the last year of our mother's life. It was about hospital corridors and insurance forms and being the one who stayed. The trust had become the tool she used to measure that absence. The courtroom, however, measured something else. Judge Whitaker turned his attention back to Allison's attorney. Does the plaintiff wish to proceed with the fraud claim? There was a long pause. The jury watched carefully. Our father leaned forward again as if he could will the outcome by posture alone. Allison's attorney conferred with her in a low voice. She shook her head once, then hesitated. He whispered again. Finally, he stood upright. The plaintiff withdraws the fraud allegation, he said. However, we request clarification regarding the adequacy of documentation moving forward. The judge nodded slightly. The court finds that the defendant's active duty status satisfies the employment requirement of the trust. The fraud claim is dismissed. No gavel. No dramatic flourish. Just a sentence that ended a legal accusation. The jurors shifted in their seats. One of them exhaled audibly. Judge Whitaker wasn't finished. Additionally, he said the court notes that federal service records are subject to restrictions not applicable to civilian employment. Any future verification disputes should be addressed through appropriate administrative channels before escalating to litigation. Administrative channels. In other words, ask before you sue. Allison's face tightened. Our father looked down at his hands. Thomas made a brief note on his pad. The judge scanned the docket. Counsel, he said to Allison's attorney, the court will entertain arguments regarding costs. That part hadn't been the focus when Allison filed the complaint. Civil fraud carries risk. Alleging it without sufficient evidence carries financial consequences. Her attorney began to speak about good faith and reliance on investigative findings. Thomas responded with precision. The plaintiff initiated a public fraud action without exhausting available verification options, he said. The defense incurred legal expenses responding to allegations that have now been dismissed. The numbers were not abstract. Filing fees, court costs, legal preparation, time away from duty. Time away from duty was something I could measure differently than most people in that room. The judge listened to both sides without interruption. After several minutes of procedural discussion, he ruled that each party would bear its own costs. Not punitive, not generous, balanced. The case was closed on the fraud issue. The trust distributions would continue under existing terms. The legal structure held. The emotional one was another matter. Allison stood before I did. She gathered her files quickly, almost mechanically. Our father rose more slowly. He avoided my eyes as he moved toward the aisle. Thomas packed his briefcase with the same calm efficiency he had shown all afternoon. "You're clear," he said quietly. "For now," I replied. He nodded once. The jury was dismissed. A few jurors glanced at me as they filed out. Their expressions were different now. Less certain. Less judgmental. Not impressed. Just recalibrated. The courtroom thinned out. Allison lingered near the railing for a moment, then walked toward me. She stopped a few feet away. "You could have told me," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp, it was tired. "I couldn't tell you everything," I answered. "I didn't need everything." The distance between those two sentences was wider than the aisle that separated our tables. She looked at the bench where the judge's chair now sat empty. "You made it look like you were hiding," she said. "I was protecting my job." "And what about Mom?" That question didn't come from her attorney. It didn't come from a legal strategy. It came from the year she carried alone. "I was where I was ordered to be," I said. She nodded slowly, but not in agreement. Our father approached, then hands in his coat pockets. He cleared his throat. "Should have just shown something," he muttered. "Any kind of proof." "There wasn't anything I could show without approval," I replied. He gave a short, skeptical exhale. "Feels like excuses." I didn't respond to that, because explaining clearance protocols to someone who believes proof equals visibility rarely changes anything. The bailiff walked past us, signaling that the courtroom needed to be cleared. Allison gathered her coat. "This didn't have to go this far," she said. "It already had." She turned toward the exit. Our father followed her. I remained standing for a moment longer, looking at the now empty bench. Judge Whitaker's nameplate was still there, steady and polished. He had done his job. So had I. Thomas waited by the door. "Ready?" he asked. I took one last look at the room where my career had been reduced to a search result. Then I stepped toward the hallway. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have. Allison walked ahead of us, her heels striking the tile in quick, sharp beats. Our father stayed close behind her, one hand resting briefly on her shoulder like she needed steadying. Thomas and I moved at a slower pace. "That went as clean as it could," he said quietly. "Clean isn't the word I'd use." He almost smiled. "Legally clean." Legally. Emotionally, it was something else. At the end of the corridor, Allison stopped near a bench under a framed county seal. She turned when she heard my steps. "You made me look stupid in there," she said. "I didn't make you do anything. You let it go all the way to court. You filed the complaint." Our father stepped between us slightly, not aggressively, just enough to change the angle. "She asked you for proof," he said. "You wouldn't give it." "I couldn't." "That's what you keep saying." "Because it was true." Allison shook her head. "You know what everyone thinks now," she said. "They think I attacked my own sister." "You did," I replied evenly. She flinched but didn't deny it. "I thought you were lying," she said. "What was I supposed to think?" "There's nothing online. No record. No company. You won't talk about it. You disappear for months. You show up for 2 hospital visits, and then you're gone again." There it was. Not fraud. Not trust clauses. Disappearance. "I was deployed," I said. "You never said that." "I said I was working." "That's not the same thing." From her perspective, it wasn't. Our father crossed his arms again. That posture hadn't changed in 20 years. "In this family," he said, "we don't hide behind secrets." "It's not a secret," I answered. "It's a restriction." He gave me the same look he used to give when I told him something he didn't understand and didn't want to. "Sounds convenient." Thomas shifted slightly, as if considering stepping in, but didn't. Allison's expression softened for half a second, then tightened again. "I took care of Mom," she said. "I was there when she couldn't walk, when she couldn't eat, when she forgot what day it was. You sent flowers. I flew in twice, for 48 hours each. I stayed as long as I was authorized." She stared at me. "Authorized by who?" she asked. I didn't answer that, because I couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was familiar. Our father broke it. "You always thought you were better than this place," he said. "No," I replied. "I just didn't stay." "That's the same thing." To him it was. A couple exiting another courtroom glanced our way, then kept walking. Word travels in small buildings like this. Allison pulled her coat tighter. "I didn't sue you for revenge," she said. "I sued you because I thought you were taking advantage of Mom." "I wasn't. You could have shown something before it got to this." I held her gaze. "Would you have believed it?" She hesitated. That hesitation answered the question. She looked down at her hands. "The investigator said there was nothing," she said quietly. "He showed me the searches. He said if someone had a real job, there would be something. That's true, I said. She looked up sharply. Then how? Federal service doesn't work like civilian employment. You could have explained that. I tried. When? In the hospital. When Mom asked. You said analysis. It was the safest word available. She gave a short, frustrated laugh. Safe for who? For everyone. But I didn't say that. Our father shifted his weight. You think we're idiots, he said. No. You think because you work in D.C., the rest of us just wouldn't understand. That's not it. Then what is it? I chose my words carefully. There are things I'm legally required not to discuss. He shook his head. Sounds like a loophole. Thomas finally stepped forward slightly. Mr. Calloway, he said evenly, the verification reviewed by the court was legitimate. Your daughter's service is not a loophole. Our father looked at him, then back at me. You should have told your sister before she hired a lawyer. I didn't know she was going to. She asked you for proof. She asked for documents I wasn't authorized to release. Allison rubbed her forehead. I wasn't trying to destroy your career, she said. I know. You think I wanted to stand in that courtroom and call you a thief? You did. Her jaw tightened. I thought you were one. There it was again. Not malicious, convinced. The fraud allegation had been dismissed, but the accusation had already been spoken out loud in front of 12 strangers. You can't unring that bell? Allison took a breath. I don't regret asking questions, she said. You regret the answer, I replied. She didn't respond. Our father looked at the exit doors. This family used to be simple, he muttered. It was never simple, I said. It just looked that way from the outside. The hallway began to empty. Lawyers drifted out. The courthouse quieted. Allison stepped back. So what now, she asked. Now the trust continues as written, I said. And the fraud claim is gone. That's it. That's it legally. She studied me for a moment longer. You don't look angry, she said. I'm not. Why? Because anger wastes energy you might need later. Because this isn't about winning, I said. It's about not losing something I worked for. Our father gave a short nod as if that at least made sense. Allison picked up her bag. I still think you could have handled this differently, she said. So do I. She paused at that. Then she walked toward the courthouse doors. Our father followed slower this time. Thomas and I stood in the quiet hallway. You held steady, he said. I didn't have much choice. No, he agreed. You didn't. I watched the doors close behind my sister. The fraud claim was gone, but the accusation had been real. And in rooms like that, real doesn't disappear just because a judge says it's dismissed. My phone vibrated before I even reached the parking lot. The screen showed a number from Fort Meade. I answered before it could ring a second time. This is Calloway. Ma'am, the voice said, clipped and familiar. We saw the docket update. Of course they did. Civil litigation involving a field-grade officer doesn't stay invisible inside the system. Yes, I replied. Fraud allegation dismissed. There was a pause on the other end. Understood. We'll need a summary memo for your security file. Nothing extensive. Just documentation. I'll send it tonight. Appreciate it, ma'am. The line went dead. Thomas stood beside my car waiting. Work, he asked. Always. He nodded. That's the part your sister doesn't see. She sees it. She just doesn't believe it. He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. Most people trust what they can Google. I didn't respond to that. Driving out of Sullivan County felt no different than driving in. Same roads. Same feed stores. Same church sign with the weekly verse posted in block letters. The difference was in how I felt behind the wheel. Not relieved. Measured. Fraud had been dismissed. But the words had still been spoken. Under oath. In front of 12 people. I pulled into a gas station off Route 9 and sat for a moment before getting out. My phone vibrated again. This time it was my executive officer. Ma'am, he said, Brigade Commander wants to know if this is resolved. It is. Anything likely to resurface? No. Another pause. You're on the slate for board review next month. I'm aware. Silence on the line. Professional silence. The kind that carries implication without stating it. Understood, he said finally. Appreciate the heads up. When I hung up, I sat in the driver's seat longer than I intended. Promotion boards don't read transcripts the way jurors do. They read risk. Even dismissed allegations generate paper. Paper generates questions. Questions slow momentum. The trust case had started as a family dispute. Now it was sitting in my clearance file. I stepped out of the car and went inside for coffee I didn't need. 2 men near the counter glanced at me. One of them looked like he recognized my father's last name. Small counties have long memories. Back in the parking lot, I checked my email. A message from the trustee had already arrived. Now that the employment issue has been clarified, we will continue annual distributions as originally structured. Clarified. That was one way to put it. The trustee hadn't called before the lawsuit was filed. He'd relied on Allison's complaint and the investigator's report. Administrative channels hadn't been exhausted. Thomas had pointed that out in court. Ask before you sue. It sounded simple when the judge said it. It hadn't felt simple standing at that defense table. I drove back toward the highway. Halfway there, I saw my father's truck pulled over on the shoulder. Hazard lights blinking. I slowed and pulled in behind him. He stood outside the driver's side door, staring at the rear tire. Flat. I stepped out. Need help? I asked. He looked surprised to see me. Got it handled, he said automatically. The spare was already on the ground. He struggled slightly with the jack, though he wouldn't admit that either. I stepped closer. Let me. He hesitated, then moved aside. We worked in silence for a few minutes. Lug nuts, jack handle, routine. You didn't have to stop, he said finally. I know. The tire came off cleanly. You still think I'm hiding something? I asked without looking at him. He took his time answering. I think you live in a world I don't understand, he said. That's different, not from where I stand. I tightened the last lug nut. You trusted a private investigator over your own daughter, I said. He had paperwork. So do I. Not that we can see. That was the line everything came back to. Visibility. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the truck. When your mother was sick, he said she asked me if you were safe. I was. She asked what you did. I told her I worked in analysis. She wanted more than that. I couldn't give her more. He looked down at the spare tire now bolted into place. She was proud of you, he said quietly. Even when she didn't understand, that hit differently than anything said in the courtroom. I lowered the jack and slid it back into the truck bed. You could have called, he said after a moment. For what? To explain. I wasn't allowed. He nodded slowly. That's the part I don't get, he said. Who tells a grown woman she can't explain her own job to her family? The government, I answered. He almost smiled at that, but it didn't quite form. That's a strange life. It's mine. He looked at me. Really looked for the first time all day. You going back tonight? Yes. He nodded once. You did good in there, he said as if the words cost something. That wasn't about doing good. No, he agreed. It wasn't. He climbed into the truck. As he pulled back onto the road, I stood for a second longer on the shoulder watching the hazard lights blink off. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Allison. We need to talk, not about court. I read it twice. Then I got back into my car and merged onto the highway traffic, moving steadily toward a skyline that never cared about local court dockets or family arguments over trust clauses. By the time I crossed into Maryland, the sun had dropped below the tree line. The case was closed on paper. The questions were not. The secure building at Fort Meade didn't care about county court rulings. Badge in. PIN. Secondary authentication. Same routine as every other morning. Inside the SCIF, there are no windows and no small-town reputations. Just terminals, access controls, and whatever tasking is sitting in your queue. I placed my bag in the locker and powered up my workstation. Before I logged in, I opened the memo template for my security update. Subject: civil litigation disclosure resolved. I kept it simple. Dates, nature of allegation, disposition. No drama, no commentary. Fraud allegation dismissed. Active duty status verified through authorized channels. I attached the docket summary and sent it to the security manager. Within minutes, a reply. Received. No further action at this time. That was it. No lecture, no suspicion. Just documentation added to a file that already held 2 decades of evaluations, deployments, and clearance reviews. Outside the secure space, the civilian world kept turning. Inside, nothing had changed. By noon, I was in a conference room reviewing operational updates. No one mentioned the lawsuit. No one asked about my sister. The Army has its own hierarchy of problems. After the meeting, my phone buzzed again. Allison. I stepped into the hallway before answering. You're back in D.C., she asked. Yes. I didn't mean for it to blow up like that. It didn't. It did. Her voice was steadier than the day before. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued. About administrative channels. That would have been a better starting point. I didn't know there were channels. You could have asked the trustee to request federal verification before filing. The investigator said there was nothing to verify. That's because he was looking in civilian databases. She was quiet for a moment. So that letter, she said it was from the Pentagon. Yes. And the judge just accepted it. He reviewed it privately. Why didn't you show it sooner? Because it required approval. From who? The Department of Defense. Silence again. You needed permission to prove you had a job, she said slowly. Yes, that's insane. It's standard. She let out a short breath. I honestly thought you'd made the whole thing up, she said. Some kind of contractor story. I know. And when you wouldn't give me paperwork, it felt like confirmation. I leaned against the wall outside the SCIF. You hired a private investigator before calling me, I said. I called you. You asked for documents. That was me asking. No, I replied. That was you preparing for court. She didn't argue that. Dad still thinks you could have shown something, she said. I showed what I was authorized to show. He says in his day a job meant a W-2. In my job, it means orders. Another pause. Were you ever in danger? She asked suddenly. That's not relevant to this. It is to me. I was where I was assigned. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give. She shifted topics. The judge, she said. How did he even understand that letter? He used to be Army JAG. You're kidding. No. That explains why he didn't look surprised. He wasn't. She exhaled slowly. I thought we had you cornered, she admitted. The report was so clean. No records, no employer, nothing. That's how it's designed. For what? For operational security. She went quiet again. I didn't mean to threaten your career, she said. It was a possibility. Did it? No, but it could have. Yes. Another long pause. I didn't think about that, she said. That's the problem. She didn't push back this time. I was angry, she said instead. You weren't there. You didn't explain. Mom kept defending you, but she couldn't tell me why. She wasn't allowed to know everything either. That seemed to land harder than anything else. You didn't tell her, Allison asked. Not details. She was dying. I know. That word didn't need elaboration. I kept thinking, Allison said slowly, if you really had some important job, you would have shown up more. I showed up when I could. You always say that. Because it's true. The hallway was quiet around me. A couple of soldiers passed by, focused on their own schedules. I'm not saying I was right, she said finally. I'm saying I felt alone. You weren't alone, I replied. You just didn't like the support you had. That's not fair. It's accurate. She didn't respond. Are you going to keep the scholarship thing? She asked abruptly. What scholarship thing? Dad said you were talking about setting one up. Something for rural girls going into government work. I'm considering it. That's you trying to prove something. No, I said. That's me doing something useful. For who? For people who don't need to justify their service in court. She was quiet again. You're not angry, she said once more, almost to herself. I don't have time to be. That's not normal. It works. She let out a short laugh that didn't quite reach humor. I guess I never really knew what you did, she said. You knew enough. No, she corrected. I knew what I could see. That's most people. She hesitated before speaking again. I'm sorry for the fraud claim, she said. That was too far. Yes, I answered. She didn't argue. I still think you could have handled it differently, she added. I think you could have started differently. That ended the debate without sounding like one. I've got to go, she said. So do I. When the call ended, I stood there a moment longer before returning to the secure space. Inside, the monitors glowed the same as they had the day before. Orders were waiting, reports were due. Outside the building, a trust dispute had turned into a public accusation and then into a sealed federal verification. Inside, it had become one more line in a file. I logged in and began reviewing the next tasking, the courtroom already reduced to a docket number in a system that measured service in years, not headlines. The next time I saw Judge Whitaker wasn't in a courtroom. It was at a veterans legal panel 2 months later in Harrisburg. I hadn't expected him to recognize me out of uniform, but he did. Colonel Calloway, he said, as he stepped down from the stage after his remarks. Your Honor, I replied. He gave a small smile. Off the bench, it's Daniel. That felt strange, but I nodded. We moved to the side of the auditorium, where the noise from the crowd softened into background conversation. I hope the verification process didn't cause complications on your end, he said. It did what it needed to do. He studied my face for a second, as if checking whether that was just a polite answer. You understand, he said, that most judges in that position wouldn't have recognized the format of that letter. I assumed as much. He nodded. Title 10. Confirmations don't come across county benches often. No, sir. He adjusted the folder under his arm. When your counsel requested in-camera review, I suspected what it was, he said. But suspicion isn't enough. It had to be clean. It was. Yes, it was. There was no pride in his tone. Just assessment. I've reviewed hundreds of service records over the years, he continued. That one was straightforward. straightforward. It hadn't felt that way sitting at the defense table. You handled yourself professionally, he added. I was trained to. He gave a quiet nod. Your sister didn't understand the system, he said. That's not uncommon. No, he agreed. But filing fraud without exhausting administrative verification was a mistake. It was. He looked toward the stage where another speaker was setting up. Family disputes tend to escalate when pride gets involved, he said. It wasn't pride, I replied. It was fear. He glanced back at me. That's often the same thing. That stayed with me longer than anything else, he said. We shook hands and he moved back toward the front of the room. There was no dramatic acknowledgement. No salute. No change in posture. Just two professionals who understood the same language. Later that evening back at Fort Meade, I sat in my office reviewing evaluation comments from my brigade commander. The language was direct, demonstrates composure under external pressure, maintains operational integrity during personal legal dispute. Someone had clearly briefed him. The lawsuit had not derailed my record. It had, if anything, reinforced something already there. Documentation over narrative. Across the hall, my executive officer stepped into the doorway. Ma'am, he said, board packet is final. You're good. Any red flags? None. He hesitated. That lawsuit didn't spook anyone. It was reviewed, he said. It didn't stick. That was the difference. Allegations can float. Verified service anchors them. When he left, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle. I thought about the moment in court when Judge Whitaker removed his glasses. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was recognition, not of me personally, but of process. He knew what a proper verification looked like. He knew what authority it carried. He knew the difference between absence of public records and absence of service. Allison had not known that. She had seen an empty search result and built a case. The judge had seen a federal seal and verified a career. The difference between those two perspectives had closed the case. A week later, Allison called again. I ran into someone at the grocery store, she said, without introduction. Okay. They asked how the trial went. What did you say? That it was dismissed. And that you're still in the Army. That's accurate. She exhaled. I didn't tell them about the Pentagon letter. You don't need to. I don't want it turning into some rumor. It won't. You don't know this town. I grew up there. She paused. Dad's still embarrassed, she said. That's his choice. He thought the judge would side with us. Why? Because it made sense to him. Sense and proof aren't the same thing. She didn't argue. Did you know the judge used to be Army? She asked. Yes. You didn't say that in court. It wasn't relevant. It feels relevant. It wasn't. She laughed softly. I guess I underestimated more than just you. Probably. There was less tension in her voice now. Not warmth. Just less friction. I've been thinking about what you said, she continued. About asking instead of assuming. That would have helped. I thought if you were innocent, you'd fight harder. I did. You were calm. Calm doesn't mean passive. That's not how it looked. That's because you were looking for guilt. She didn't deny it. I told Dad the judge wasn't just some small-town guy, she said. He's not. He understood that letter immediately. Yes, that must have been a relief. It was confirmation. For you. For the court. Silence again. You know, she said slowly when he asked if we wanted to proceed with fraud. It felt like the floor dropped. It should have. I didn't realize how serious that word was. It's serious everywhere. She shifted her tone slightly. I don't want us to be the sisters who only talk through lawyers. Then don't hire one next time. A small pause, then a short, genuine laugh. Fair. The call ended without tension. Not repaired. Just stable. That evening I reviewed the draft paperwork for the scholarship fund. Johnson Rural Service Scholarship. Support for young women from agricultural counties pursuing STEM degrees, tied to federal or public service. No rank listed. No branch listed. Just my name. It wasn't about proving anything to Allison or to our father. It was about offering a path that didn't require explanation to be valid. In the quiet of my office, the events of the courtroom felt smaller. Not because they didn't matter, but because they had been handled. By process. By documentation. By a judge who knew the system well enough not to confuse invisibility with absence. And that difference had changed everything. The promotion ceremony took place in a briefing room, not a ballroom. No orchestra. No dramatic lighting. Just a formation of officers in service uniforms, and a short set of remarks from the commanding general. I stood at attention while my new assignment orders were read aloud. Senior staff role. Expanded operational oversight. Same clearance. Higher expectations. When it was over, there were handshakes. A few quick congratulations, and then everyone went back to work. That's how most milestones happen in the Army. No applause from a jury. No all rise. Just paperwork and responsibility. That afternoon, I drove to the small cemetery outside town where my mother was buried. I hadn't been back since the dedication of the scholarship. The headstone was simple. Name, dates, nothing elaborate. I stood there without rehearsing anything in my head. The last time I'd been near that grave, the lawsuit was still fresh. Fraud had been spoken out loud in a courtroom. My employment had been treated like fiction. Now it was documented, reviewed, and placed back where it belonged. I didn't need to say that out loud. A pickup truck rolled slowly past on the road nearby. Rural traffic, familiar rhythm. My phone buzzed. Allison. I let it ring once before answering. "You're at Mom's," she said. "How do you know?" "You always go quiet on Sundays. That's one way to track me." She gave a small laugh. "Dad's been asking about the scholarship," she said. "He told someone at church you funded it." "That's accurate. He said you didn't put your rank on it." "I didn't. He doesn't understand that either." "That's consistent." There was no tension in her voice now, just observation. I told him it's not about proving anything, she said. "It never was." "You know," she continued, "I thought when the judge read that letter he was about to lecture us." "He wasn't. He just stated the facts. That's his job." She was quiet for a second. "I replayed that moment a lot," she admitted. "When he asked if we wanted to proceed with fraud." That's a heavy word. I didn't feel the weight of it until he said it back to us. Most people don't. A breeze moved through the trees above the cemetery. "I don't want to be the sister who filed a fraud claim against a colonel," she said lightly. "You're not." "What am I then?" "Someone who trusted the wrong evidence." "That sounds generous." "It's accurate." She paused. "I was scared," she said finally. "Mortgage, market, Mom gone. You out there somewhere I couldn't see." "That's honest." "Fear makes people loud." "It does. And you weren't loud." "I didn't need to be." She exhaled slowly. "I guess I thought if you were really that important, you'd make it obvious. I don't work in a field that rewards obvious." Clearly, a hint of humor slipped into her tone. "Dad says he should have asked you directly before backing the lawsuit. That would have been efficient." "He won't say that to you." "That's fine." She shifted topics. "Are you coming home for Thanksgiving this year?" "I can." "That's not the same as yes." "Yes." She sounded relieved. "Good." We didn't discuss the lawsuit again. After the call ended, I remained by the headstone for a moment longer. My mother had known enough to build a trust with structure. She'd anticipated friction. She'd tried to balance two daughters living in different worlds. The court had measured eligibility. Life measured something else. Driving back towards the highway, I passed the old feed store. The same hardware store where Bill Anderson worked. The same diner where our father used to sit on Saturday mornings. Nothing had physically changed, but perception had. The story circulating now wasn't that I'd been stealing. It was that the case hadn't held up. That mattered. At Fort Meade, my new office was slightly larger, but not dramatically so. More responsibility. More oversight. On my first day in the new role, I met with a team of analysts fresh out of training. One of them mentioned she'd grown up in a farming town in Ohio. "I didn't think people from places like that ended up here," she said casually. "They do," I replied. "Did you always know you'd go military?" "No." "What changed your mind?" "I thought about that for a second. I didn't fit where I was," I said. "So I found somewhere I did." She nodded as if that made sense. It did. Later that evening, I opened the scholarship application portal. The first batch of essays had come in. One student wrote about feeling out of place in her county high school because she wanted to study computer science instead of agriculture. Another wrote about wanting to serve but not knowing how. I approved the review committee's shortlist without fanfare. There was no courtroom attached to any of it. No jurors, no accusations, just paperwork and opportunity. A few weeks later, Allison sent me a photo. Dad standing in front of the scholarship plaque at the library. Hands in his coat pockets. Looking slightly uncomfortable, but present. He asked the librarian how it worked, she wrote. "That's progress," I replied. "Small steps," she answered. Small steps were enough. The trust continued its annual distribution quietly. No new disputes, no additional letters. In my clearance file, the civil litigation entry remained as a closed item. Reviewed, resolved. Documentation outlasts noise. One evening, sitting alone in my office after everyone else had left, I thought about the words that had started everything. She hasn't worked a real job in years. That sentence had been built on absence. Absence of visible records, absence from hospital rooms, absence from family dinners. But absence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's distance, and sometimes distance is duty. The courtroom had measured employment. The promotion board had measured performance. The scholarship would measure possibility. None of those required applause. I shut down my computer, locked the office, and stepped into the hallway where fluorescent lights hummed the same steady tone they always had. The work remained. So did I. Silence looks suspicious when people don't understand it. That's what I learned the hard way. My sister thought she was protecting our mother's trust. My father thought he was defending common sense. The jury thought they were deciding a simple family dispute. But not every job leaves a paper trail you can print out in a courtroom. Not every absence means neglect. And not every quiet person is hiding something. In the end, nothing magical happened. No dramatic speeches. No revenge scenes. Just documentation process and the truth standing on its own. The lawsuit collapsed because it couldn't survive verification. The trust continued as written. My career moved forward. And my family learned that assuming the worst is a risky strategy. Family revenge stories aren't always about destroying someone. Sometimes they're about holding your ground without yelling. Family drama doesn't always end with a big apology. Sometimes it ends with boundaries and better questions. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this: visibility isn't the same as value. If you enjoy stories about family revenge, courtroom drama, and military careers, where quiet competence beats loud accusations, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are more real-world stories like this about family conflict, legal battles, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself.